Okay, so in the first video, we talked about the preparation that goes into painting, and that is sanding joints down so you don't get paint rubs, and priming to help make it easier for your paint to adhere to your figure and for the paint to remain on your figure once you're done painting. Now we'll get into basically just color selection. So using this particular figure as an example, this is something that exists in the real world. So realistic military custom or law enforcement for this example. This is something that does exist in the real world, what I suggest for this type of custom is Google image and just see to see what these guys look like in the real world. What color are the uniforms? What color are the camo patterns that they use? Just to help you decide how you want to paint it, what colors you want to use. When I do G.I. Joe customs, Google image to look at other customizers' work, sometimes to avoid what they've done, not because it's bad, just because I want mine to be unique, perhaps. So I'll avoid what others have done, so mine will stand out a little bit. On the flip side of that, I'll look at other people's customs to get ideas, see what colors work well, and what painting styles work well with a particular custom. So you do a little research to figure out what colors you're going to want to use. Once you've decided what colors you're going to use, specifically for this particular custom, I've based mine off of how he was described in the book that I mentioned earlier, and that description was that he was wearing a kind of an olive drab flight suit with body armor over it. So green, olive drab green is going to be my kind of basically my color scheme. So now we talk about painting, and I use a 3-step painting process or 3-step painting system, however you want to say that. And that starts off with a base coat, followed by a wash, followed by dry brushing. So my base coat is a medium color. So olive drab, I'm going to use for this particular custom, I'm going to use a medium. So between dark, light, and medium, I'm going to use a medium for the base coat. I'm going to do a wash in a darker color, and I'm going to dry brush with a lighter color. Dark, medium, dark, light. So what is a wash? Wash is kind of a watered down paint that helps bring out the details in the sculpt, particularly areas where shadows would be. So like the folds of clothing, the cracks, the seams in the vests, stuff like that in equipment, the inner parts where there's shadows. Because if you look at something, if you look at anything, it's not just one color. Like my hoodie right now it's green, but it's not one shade of green. So where the light is hitting it, it's a lighter green than where the shadow is. So what I do to emulate that is pick the medium green, paint a base coat on that, do a wash over that with a darker color, and then dry brush to get the highlights. So I'll do the base coat in the medium color, do a wash with a darker color to bring out the shadows, and then do a dry brush with a lighter color to bring out the highlights. So we talked about what a wash is. So what is dry brushing? Dry brushing is where you get paint on the brush, and I'll show these techniques as we do them, and some of this I've already shot, so I'll probably be re-explaining this as we go. But you get paint on the brush, you let it dry until it's almost dry, but not quite, and then brush it on. And I'll demonstrate that here in a little bit. Right, so base coat is the first, just doing a base coat. We're going to paint everything green that's going to be green.
I'm going to do just the flight suit in green, and then I think I mentioned earlier in the video that I'm going to do the plate carrier and the holster and the pouches and stuff like that are going to be in a tan. I think more realistic would be to do them in a darker green, but I really like how dark green and tan work together. They really are complementary colors together, so that's why I'm going to go with that instead of going like totally realistic. I'm going to kind of use artistic license on this. So again, we're going to do just the base coat with the green. Water, I use just a little bit of water, mix a little bit of paint, and just paint it, and we're going to let it dry. Cloth to clean the brush. I'm using just whatever brush I get from the hobby store, and I'm using a number 0 brush. I like to paint with a lot with very small brushes. 0 is not the smallest, but it's a nice size for a base coat. And we're going to try the time-lapse photography here. So hopefully this will work and you can watch me paint the base coat on this. So let's see how that works. Okay, so there's the base coat done. All right. Not much to it. And you'll notice it's not what you might exactly call a clean paint job. Okay, by clean I mean it's not, we didn't color within the lines, all right? So, and you notice I didn't hit all of the legs. There's some sculpting on the legs that are like patches. I did the same on the sleeve, on the uniform. And a pouch on the lower leg too there, on his ankle. I'm gonna do those either in a lighter shade of green or tan. I'm thinking maybe tan, just to make it kind of stand out. Again, not necessarily a clean paint job because we're just laying down a base coat. I will do touch-ups as the final step, where I go back and make sure my lines are clean on borders. We're just getting the working base coat down right now. And also by clean, I mean it's not one solid color. It's kind of hard to see it in the video, unfortunately, but if I can find a good example, you can see that it's a little thin here. You can almost kind of see the white underneath, and that's fine. I don't, if you look at my shirt in the video, you can see it's not all solid black. It's light gray where the light is hitting it. So that's part of getting a realistic paint job on your figures. Is nothing is one solid color. That's why we do washes and why we do dry brushes on top of the base coat. Nothing is one solid color in real life. Now the trick to the base coat, as you can see, like where it's thinner, is doing a thin base coat. You don't want thick paint. You don't want to make it look like you've melted crayons onto your figure. So that is the trick to the base coat. So we're going to let this dry a little bit, and then we're going to do the wash. Alright, so we've got our base coat done, and I've reassembled the figure for the next step. And I put them on a figure stand from one of the cases that they come with. The only thing I don't like about the Joy Toy figures is the proprietary foot peg size, so I can't use any of the other figure stands, like the million figure stands that I have. either G.I. Joe, Star Wars, or I bought a couple hundred figure stands from Small Joe's a bunch of years ago. Excuse me. But I like to paint my figures on figure stands. That way I don't touch them and take the paint off my hands. I'm not worried about getting my hands dirty, but I am worried about smearing paint jobs and getting fingerprints in the paint, which has happened on a couple of occasions, and it's irritating. Hopefully, now that I also want to mention, hopefully that time-lapse video worked well enough. I don't know if I can control the frame rate. I know it was only like 30 seconds for like half an hour, so I would have liked to extended that to like at least a couple minutes, but I don't know if I can change the frame rate on that. Again, I'm just impressed that I can do it to begin with, so hopefully that will work. This next step I am not going to do in not slow motion, time lapse. Sorry. The next step is we're going to do the wash, and I'm using Citadel, and they don't call them washes anymore, they call them shades, and they do come in these bigger bottles, and I am using Anthonian Camo Shade, and I use this, I've got 2 bottles of this, because I go through it so quickly, so I'm going to shake that up a little bit. The trick to shading, couple tricks to shading. Shading, you're trying to get the paint in the crevices, in the folds, as opposed to dry brushing where you're trying to get the raised surfaces. So if you're looking at my shirt, we're getting the darker in the crevices and the lighter on the raised areas is what our goal is. So that's the first trick. And the second trick is kind of counterintuitive to everything I've been saying about how much paint to use, because this stuff I do tend to just slop on there because it does kind of need to be thicker. Not thicker, but I use more of it. So I load my brush up with quite a bit, and then I dab it on there. And it's a darker shade of paint to begin with on the base coat. So load your brush and just dab it on there, and then you'll see the effect start to take place. Hopefully I can get a shot of that. Probably not real good. You can see where it's wet. I'm sorry I can't get a better picture of this. This is something you're going to have to do on your own just to visualize, I think. But dab it on there. Load your brush, dab it on there. Load your brush, just dab it on there. You really can't use too much of this for the most part. And remember, you're trying to get it in the creases. And if you're seeing it build up in one spot, kind of just brush it out into the surrounding areas to thin it out a little bit. So you can get it a little too thick. You want kind of an even coat. It's still heavy, but it's an even coat. Load your brush, dab it on. Load your brush, dab it on. And like areas under the plate carrier, I'm doing a heavier coat of it under there. I'm not brushing that into. It's really building up under there. That's an area that's going to be shaded to begin with in natural light, so there's going to be shadows there. So that's all right. So what I normally do on this, when I do a base coat, I do the front, and then I do the back, and I let it dry in between. So I do the front, and then I let it dry. Otherwise, I have a propensity for handling my figures well, the paint is wet, and then it kind of defeats the purpose. So dab it on there. Load the brush, dab it on there. And again, this really is not that difficult. You can see I am just basically slopping paint on here. I'm getting some on his shoe. It's running off onto his shoe. I don't care. Why don't I care? Because I'm going to paint his boots. I'm going to paint his boots a different color. So just having a little light green, having a little green wash on there is not the end of the world. You really don't have to have fantastic brush control to have decent customs. I mean, obviously, you want to have decent brush control when you want to do paint eyes or skin, but just to do this, there's not a lot of brush control to this. I am slopping paint on here. And nowadays, I don't think it'd be such a problem, but I'll bet 10, 15 years ago, I'd be getting some nasty grams from some of the better customizers about giving away trade secrets. So I know a lot of customizers, this is how they do their stuff, how they do their work. And I'm kind of violating my rules. I'm doing some of the back here too, but at the same time. But since he's on a figure stand, I'm not too worried about handling the wet paint. Load the brush, slop it on. Put a happy little puddle here. How's that for Bob Ross? Channeling Bob Ross. I'm going to put a happy little puddle here. And this stuff does need to dry a little longer than the base coat. One of the things that I do, since you are kind of puddling it, if it does get a little too thick, it will start to dry really dark. So you kind of want to go back and look at it as you're painting it, and if it's really puddled up down here at the bottom. So I'm just running my brush through that, taking off the excess, and I'm putting it in other areas. So I'm thinning it out a little bit. Since we're putting so much on, gravity tends to have an effect on this since it's really watery. So any low-lying areas like this, any gravity-dependent areas, you need to check to make sure that it's not going to puddle up. Load the brush, slop it on. Now you can see, whoa, that's a little bit too much. Now you can see why I go through this stuff so quickly. It's because you use a lot of it. It really is just fantastic stuff. There's some areas that I'm not going to be able to hit with him posed like this. So I'm going to have to wait until it's dry, and then I'll go back and hit the areas that I missed. Slop that on there, really, really good. So I'm really slapping it on, where the plate carrier, the vest, meets the body. Because it's shadows there. and now you can kind of, if you've gotten a base coat like mine and you can see some of the white through there, through the base coat, because you did a good job of not putting too much base coat on. This is where that really, where the wash really starts to blend stuff together. All right, so I can't get the bottom of his arms because it, I got paint on the wife's placemat here. So luckily it's green, but it's a different shade of green. This is not my normal customizing area. Number one, I'm doing this because the lighting is better up here for photography. And number two, I'm babysitting the new puppy. So I would show you to her, but she's asleep and I don't want to wake the baby. All right, so I'm going back and I'm finding out, looking at the gravity dependent areas where it started to puddle, and I'm running my brush through there, making sure that I bring it up to other areas. All right, I like how that looks. All right, I'm gonna let this dry for probably at least half an hour. This is why I usually have more than one custom running at a time. Or I'll work on the accessories, but I'm going to customize a gun for him. But again, that's going to be part of the painting tutorial, so I'm not going to do that right now. This is start to finish, so we're just going to take a break here and let this dry. Still waiting for the wash to dry. It was dry for the most part, so I went back and looked at the figure once it was dry, and found a few places that I didn't like where it wasn't dark enough, where I don't think where I didn't get enough of the wash. So that's working right now. I don't know that the video is going to be able to show the detail on how well the wash worked. You can really see it on the bottom legs. Those are areas, sleeves and legs are areas that washes really tend to work really well on your figures. You look at some of the really nice customs that people do this, and you'll see it's the washes on the legs and the arms that you really notice. So while we're waiting for that to dry, I'm going to talk about dry brushing. So washing is, I think you could technically consider that wet brushing. So if you're wondering what wet brushing versus dry brushing is, I would consider that wet brushing because you're using very watery paint, whereas dry brushing, we're going to use paint that's almost dry. And I think for this guy to really bring out the sculpt that's in this figure, and there is a lot of nice sculpt in this figure, I'm going to do a two-tone dry brush. So I'm going to remember how we said we start off with a mid-range for the base coat, a darker wash, and then a lighter dry brush. So I'm going to do a lighter color dry brush, and then I'm going to do a lighter shade than that on top of that. So the color that I'm going to dry brush first is Death World Forest, and we'll compare that with the base coat here, and you can see the difference, how that's just a bit shade lighter. And then the shade that I'm going to dry brush on top of that is Elysian Green, and you can see the difference in the shade there. And there's all three of them together, and all four of them with the wash. So you can see how we went with the, with the base coat here, went with a darker wash, and then we're going to do a 2-step down dry brush. Now for dry brushing, this is where I think the equipment is probably the most important part of the technique, because to me it's all about the brush on this. That's kind of the bad news. The good news is this is the shittiest brush that you can possibly get, and it's these little testers brushes that come in 3 packs. Anywhere that sells like modeling kits, like airplane models and NASCAR models, they have the testers paint, and they've always got these 3 packs of these brushes, and these are the shittiest brushes. I mean, literally just garbage brushes. However, I have never found anything that dry brushes as well as these do. And so I'm going to pause it here and wait for this to dry, and then we'll talk about the technique of dry brushing.
Actually, in an effort to break up the videos, I'm not going to pause it here. I'm going to break it up here. So we've talked about doing the base coat in a medium color, and then doing the wash in a darker color, and then doing the 2-tone dry brushing in 2 lighter colors. Well, we're going to talk about the dry brushing and how to do that with the crappiest brush ever, but it's not the crappiest brush because it's the best brush for dry brushing. We're going to talk about that in the next video because I've already shot that part and just doing the editing, and it would have put it over 30 minutes, and I did promise to make these about 30 minutes in content to kind of help break this up and make these not too long, to make these more palatable, not to get overwhelmed. So stay tuned for the 3rd video in the series, which we'll talk about dry brushing.